Had the live-action version of Mulan been produced by a different studio with no connections to the animated version, such as the 2009 production Mulan, Rise of a Warrior, I would have been more understanding of the divide between the two Disney films. After all, filmmakers are entitled to interpret stories in different ways. However, since the live-action reboot had an undeniable connection to its animated predecessor, I believe the expectations that I had for the film were reasonable, and that my comparisons between the two films are fair. In this video, I'm going to explore why Disney's earlier animated version of Mulan, produced in 1998, is more enjoyable, memorable, and meaningful than the live-action version produced in 2020. My goal with this film is to highlight the strengths of the animated film and bring attention to the ways in which animation as an art form can create experiences that live action cannot always measure up to. My intention is not to bash the live action version so much as to celebrate the achievements of the animated film. To explore the differences between the animated film and the live action film, I will focus on three key areas: story, character, and music. The character of Mulan is based on a Chinese legend, which tells the story of a young woman who takes the place of her older father after he's conscripted to join the Chinese army. While on the surface this legend has all the ingredients for a grand story about war and fighting, Disney's original film chose instead to focus the audience's attention on the emotional journey Mulan undertakes to protect and honor her father and ultimately realize her true potential. While the animated film was marketed as the story of a warrior, the animated film is surprisingly lacking in action and in fact involves relatively few scenes where characters use martial arts. The majority of scenes are straightforward drama scenes mixed with moments of light-hearted comic relief and scenes of exploration and travel between beautiful exotic locations. Most of the fighting between the Chinese army and the Huns is condensed into the third act, and even then it is used sparingly. The live-action version feels like it belongs in an entirely different genre. While the animated film is primarily an emotional film that uses action sparingly, the live-action version feels like an action film which uses emotion sparingly. This difference represents the major fork in the road where we see the animated film and the live-action film diverge most acutely. While the animated film uses war and combat as a backdrop to foreground Mulan's more important inner journey, the live-action film inverts this structure by using Mulan's inner journey as a backdrop to foreground war and combat. While there are many differences between the two films, I believe this is arguably one of the most important since it underpins much of the divide. There is nothing intrinsically wrong with action films that emphasize war and combat. However, an overly serious focus on war and combat robs the live-action version of Mulan of the charming spirit that the animated version effortlessly conveys through its light-hearted tone and tender emphasis on Mulan's inner journey. In summary, the live-action version of Mulan fails to articulate the emotional, universal meaning of the Mulan legend by neglecting Mulan's personal inner journey in service of shallow, lifeless combat sequences and a war that ultimately feels irrelevant. The animated version of Mulan will always feel more meaningful because it's not really a story about a war between two nations. It's a personal story about the timeless war going on in each and every one of us. It's the war between the person society expects us to be and who we truly are. The overall story structure, genre, and tone clearly differs between Mulan 1998 and Mulan 2020. However, the divide between the two films is truly laid bare in the poor characterization we see in the live-action film, as opposed to the effective characterization we see in the original. Let's consider how we are introduced to Mulan in both films. In the animated version, the opening sequence is used to show that the Huns have arrived at China's border and threaten the stability of the empire. This is an excellent way to hook the audience in and create anticipation before we meet our central character. The scene that follows introduces us to the Emperor as he is briefed by General Li and warned about the potential consequences the Han invasion may lead to. Despite General Li's insistence that his army can manage the threat, the Emperor decides to further conscript a man from every Chinese family to aid the army in their defense. As he says, "A single grain of rice can tip the scale. One man may be the difference between victory and defeat." We then cut to a bowl of rice. What follows is arguably one of the best setups in an animated film, as we are introduced to Mulan, made aware of her potential for growth, introduced to her horse, her father, and the ancestral shrine, which will become an important part of the story with the introduction of Mushu later on. This sequence is expertly crafted from a narrative perspective, and therefore worthy of analysis. Let's begin by focusing on how the filmmakers introduce us to Mulan. Consider how she is presented. An intimate close-up shows she is not yet fully clothed. This is a subtle detail, but it's effective in making Mulan more approachable and relatable. While one may not be aware of it, her vulnerability is endearing. As she sits on her bed, she recites the words, "quiet and demure, graceful and delicate," before stuffing her mouth full of rice. With her mouth full, she then says delicate, refined, poised, while she writes crib notes on her arm. Finally, she reads the word punctual before realizing that she's running late. She jumps out of bed to feed the chickens, but instead of doing the chore herself, she cleverly attaches a contraption to the family dog so that he can disperse the chicken feed for her. This is a clever gag because it establishes that Mulan is neglecting her responsibilities while at the same time demonstrating her ingenuity. As Mulan's dog, named Little Brother, runs through the family compound, we are introduced to Mulan's horse. The camera follows Little Brother before it guides the frame to the family's ancestral shrine, where Mulan's father, Fao Zhu, is praying for Mulan to be successfully married off by the village's matchmaker in a ceremony set to take place that day. Based on the father's heartfelt prayers, it is clear that he is doubtful about Mulan and worried about her chances of success. Mulan then arrives at the shrine with tea, but clumsily drops the tray carrying a cup and kettle. The cup shatters on the floor, but Fao Zhu catches the kettle, while Mulan produces a spare cup from a pocket. This exchange establishes a powerful contrast between the chaotic character of Mulan and that of the disciplined, responsible Fao Zhu. While Mulan is clearly flawed, she is redeemed by her sincere concern for her father, which she demonstrates by reminding him that he needs to drink 6 cups of tea a day, as per the doctor's orders. The scene ends as Fao Zhu reminds Mulan to uphold the family honor, a line Mulan repeats back to him to show him she's well aware. Of course, in true Mulan fashion, she reassures her father while at the same time hiding the crib notes on her arm. This introduction to Mulan is so effective because it does so many different things all at once. By pulling us into a whirlwind of contrasts, it sets Mulan up as flawed yet likable, irresponsible yet ingenious, clumsy yet considerate. It also establishes key elements of the story, such as the role of humor and the spirits of the ancestors. Crucially, Mulan is not shown to be anything special. She is actually in need of growth and maturation when we first meet her. She is not shown to be a fighter, possess great skill, or have any of the makings of a legendary hero. In other words, she's just an ordinary, imperfect young woman. But like all memorable adventures, it's often the least likely who are called, and whose tales of heroism are ultimately most revered. Everything that I admire about the introduction to Mulan in the animated film is tragically absent in the live-action version. The result is an introduction to Mulan which feels tone-deaf, narratively hollow, and at times downright bizarre. I wish the introduction was an exception to the rest of the film. However, it encapsulates much of what is wrong with the film as a whole. The live-action film starts off on the wrong foot from the very first shot, with the inclusion of narration which is delivered by Mulan's father. It frames Mulan through his eyes. The inclusion of this narration seems antithetical to the story of Mulan, since it's the story of a young woman determining her own destiny. In short, it's Mulan's story, not her father's. What we quickly notice when we first see Mulan is that she is still a child. This serves no purpose in terms of characterization, and as far as I can tell, does not advance the narrative. I believe that the film should have started with Mulan as a young woman, not as a child. To make matters all the more confusing, Mulan initially appears to have more in common with Neo from The Matrix than the charming, ingenious young woman we were originally introduced to in the animated film. From a characterization point of view, I think this is probably the film's greatest flaw. How is an audience supposed to invest in a character if they are already so developed? Imagine if Frodo had been a powerful warrior in Lord of the Rings before he undertook his mission to Mordor. It would have been a much less memorable story. In fact, Lord of the Rings is a great story precisely because the odds were so overwhelmingly stacked against Frodo. That's how stories work. Drama is the product of a character attempting to overcome an obstacle. The greater the obstacle, the greater the drama. It's an ancient, simple formula, but apparently one that Mulan 2020 had no interest in respecting. The animated version of Mulan relied on the protagonist not being special. The whole story was built around Mulan's imperfections, hence why she had to train like crazy and outsmart her enemies to defeat them as opposed to defeat them with brute force. All the tension and drama that held the animated film together was extinguished in the live-action version when Mulan was characterized as an unrelatable master warrior rather than a flawed young woman clumsily trying to find her place in the world. While the absence of sing-along music in Mulan 2020 may seem like a trivial creative difference to some, I believe that it's a far more serious problem that impacts narrative development and characterization. The music in the animated film wasn't just effective because it made audiences feel good. It performed an important function by reinforcing themes and advancing the narrative forward. For instance, after Mulan's chaotic experience at the matchmaker, she returns home and sings the song titled Reflection. A section of the lyrics reads, "Who is that girl I see, staring back at me? Why is my reflection someone I don't know? Somehow I cannot hide who I am, though I've tried. When will my reflection show who I am inside?" Without this song, we would have a very superficial understanding of Mulan's inner emotional conflict. That's why the songs in the animated film are so special. They connect us to the complex inner workings of Mulan's heart and spirit, and in doing so make her more interesting and relatable. With each new song, we grow more invested in Mulan's journey and the outcome of her adventure. The music in the animated film also serves the plot by giving the audience breathing space between scenes. For instance, the song Reflection is performed between the matchmaker scene and the scene where Mulan's father is conscripted. In the live-action version, there is no song and therefore no breathing room. In the live-action version, Mulan simply departs from the matchmaker and then the Chinese army arrives immediately after. The conscription scene in the animated film is another great example of the film's superior characterization, as it shows Mulan recklessly yet bravely protecting her father from conscription. It's an essential scene that establishes Mulan as the stubborn, bold character she is. Without it, her decision to steal her father's armor and leave in the dead of night would be more difficult to believe. In the live-action film, she's not given this opportunity to demonstrate these aspects of her character, because in that moment when her father is being conscripted, she is held back by her sister and mother. It's just one of many disappointing moments in the live-action film that seem to pale in comparison to the animated version. The live-action reboot of Mulan is filled with unusual elements that seem out of place, such as the inclusion of Chi, the witch character, the phoenix, people running on walls, and excessive levels of combat. However, its greatest flaws are its poor narrative structure and shallow characterization. The animated version of Mulan is so successful because its story is structured around Mulan's inner journey, and it doesn't focus on war. Instead, it uses war as a backdrop to her personal transformation. The narrative is further enhanced with masterful characterization that makes Mulan's journey believable, dramatic, and worthy of our time. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please support this channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. This is In-Depth Annie. Thanks for watching.